1939. It is the beginning of World War II. Nations clashing together and heroes emerging. Soldiers and civilians are dying, while some are left barely alive. A call for help was made to the home front. More blood was needed. In 1940, African-American surgeon and researcher Dr. Charles Drew established a method of collecting and preserving high-quality blood plasma, enabling blood to be stored outside the body for up to 2 months. This method of banking blood was a turning point in medicine, immediately implemented during World War II, saving hundreds of thousands of lives. Drew then became the first ever medical director of the American Red Cross, a turning point for African Americans in medicine. The history of blood transfusions dates back to the 1600s. The first successful human blood transfusion was performed by British physician James Blundell in 1818, directly from one person to another. However, it was an extensive process to replicate that proved to be unpredictable, often killing the patient. In the 1860s, during the Civil War, blood loss was the major cause of death, and doctors recorded only 2 successful transfusions. Soon after the Civil War ended, the role of African Americans in medicine was slow to change. Jim Crow laws established by states legalized segregation, stifling the rights outlined by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, as assumptions about the racial inferiority of African Americans remained. As wars went on, innovations in military medicine followed. In 1914, at the beginning of World War I, researchers discovered a temporary way to preserve whole blood. Oswald Robertson, a medical officer in the war, used this technology to set up 2 small-scale blood banks, performing 22 successful transfusions with the stored blood. Charles Drew went on to study medicine at McGill University in Canada after segregation excluded him from American medical schools. After graduating in 1933, Drew wanted to train in transfusion therapy at the Mayo Clinic, but prejudice prevented him. This was also the height of the Great Depression, causing widespread unemployment. Despite these obstacles, he was admitted to the Whipple's surgical residency program at Columbia University's Presbyterian Hospital in New York, becoming the first African-American doctor to train there. In 1939, Drew spent much of his time researching the most arduous medical problem, banking blood. The challenge came from the blood's short-lived life out of the body.
At that time, the only types of blood that could be stored was whole blood. And this was problematic because it could only be stored for a few days, about a week. And because of that, it could not be replenished fast enough.
Drew's research led him to an important discovery in medicine. When the blood plasma is separated from the rest of the blood, the new shelf life increases from 1 week to 2 months, and the plasma is not subject to blood type. In 1940, Drew compiled his research into a 356-page dissertation named Banked Blood, a study in blood preservation. This made him the first African American to earn a medical doctorate from Columbia. His thesis was immediately hailed as a masterpiece and received international attention. As World War II heated, Great Britain came under attack. British officials immediately recruited Drew to lead the Blood for Britain program. Britain requested 5,000 vials of dried plasma to decrease combat casualties. On the battlefield, where time is of the essence, the plasma can quickly be given to soldiers who would otherwise go into shock and be pronounced dead. Drew's discovery that plasma could replace whole blood became a critical turning point for emergency medicine, saving countless lives. John Streihards, a United States Marine, shared his thoughts on receiving plasma on the battlefield. "It was as though I was rising, being lifted right up off the ground. The best thing I can compare it to is being out of breath and all of a sudden getting your breath back." To meet the need of all this blood, Drew set up blood drives in New York, lasting over 5 months, with over 15,000 American blood donors of all races participating. In addition to this success, Drew created programs like the National Blood Donor Service, which collected and froze plasma for use by American forces. Drew then implemented his technology into trucks called bloodmobiles, which the British Army used to refrigerate blood and quickly treat the wounded. Due to these initiatives, in 1941, the American Red Cross asked Dr. Charles Drew to be the first director of its blood bank, a turning point for African Americans in medicine. This blood bank was to prepare the Americans for entry into World War II. Drew was able to help create 35 blood reserves, and plasma became known as the outstanding medical discovery of the war. The foremost lifesaver, the Surgeon General of the Army declared, is plasma, the dried blood extract that millions of Americans have been giving the Red Cross for nearly 2 years. During Drew's work in blood preservation, he received a hate mail. One writer said that if his white son was wounded on the battlefield, and the only way to save him was to transfuse him with a black donor's blood, he would say, "Let him die." In 1942, pressured from the then segregated U.S. military, the American Red Cross began to segregate blood by race, ironically preventing Drew from donating to the blood banks he had helped establish. Drew, infuriated, resigned in protest.
After Pearl Harbor, African Americans really wanted to become part of the war effort, and they began to donate blood, and then they found out that the blood was to be segregated. So there was great anger with respect to that decision from African Americans who said, we're willing to fight and die in a war, and you are segregating the blood of African Americans and white Americans.
Civil rights activists compared the segregation of blood to Nazi policies, stating there was no difference between white and African American blood. In a 1944 survey of 2,523 white Americans, 36% said Negro blood was the same as white blood, while 32% were unsure of the difference, indicating that the public was not as opposed to the integration of blood as previously thought. As Charles Drew stated in 1944, one can say quite truthfully that on the battlefields, nobody is very interested in where the plasma comes from when they are hurt.
He actually resigned in protest because he said there's no scientific basis on which to segregate blood, only separate blood according to blood type.
Finally, in 1947, the Red Cross issued a statement based on scientific evidence and medical opinion that there was no difference in the blood of humans based on race or color. Tragically, in 1950, in the early morning hours, Drew died at just 45 years old in a car accident. His loss of blood was so great that he could not be saved. His tragic death, a byproduct of segregation.
There were very few places where African Americans traveling in the South could lay their heads, not hotels, not motels. There were no hotels or motels along the way. Dr. Drew need not have been driving at 5 o'clock in the morning, and his associates need not have been on the road in the middle of the night if there had been hotels or motels along the way.
Although the Red Cross stopped the segregation of so-called Negro blood, it was not until the late 1960s and early 1970s that Southern states overturned blood segregation. More than 38,000 blood donations are needed every day, and thanks to Drew, the widespread use of blood banks has become a turning point in medicine, being implemented all over the U.S., saving millions of lives. However, according to the American Red Cross, today, Black Americans donate blood at disproportionately low rates. Despite making up 13% of the national population, they account for less than 3% of blood donors. This may be attributed to attitudes developed by years of racial injustice, including the segregation of blood. Despite this, Drew's creation of the National Blood Donor Service was a turning point in history, making blood available to all, and Drew's program collects about half of the blood transfused in the U.S. today. Drew's appointment as the first ever medical director of the American Red Cross was a turning point for African Americans in medicine, and his work in preserving blood plasma proved to be a turning point in medicine and a miracle on the battlefield.
His impact on modern medicine is almost immeasurable. It's monumental. And that process of separating red blood cells from plasma is what we are still using right now in this moment to support patients who are trying to recover.
Today, Drew is known as the father of the blood bank, and his lifelong work proves that despite the race, the color of blood remains the same.